Welcome to the P.A.S. report, everyone, and make sure that you are following and subscribing to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. I am your host, Nick Giordano. Visit the P.A.S. report website, pasreport.com. Make sure that you share this episode with your family, friends, and on social media, because I got a great guest today. I have Hayden Ludwig, is the Director of Policy Research for Restoration of America. Hayden, I'm so glad that you could join me. How are you today?
Nick, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join your show.
Well, you have a unique background, doing some research, investigative journalism. You're someone that focuses on elections and dark money. And the dark money is actually extremely important in this day and age, whether it's dark money in our political system or dark money to going through nonprofits and other philanthropy groups. Dark money has become a real problem in the United States, especially. I find it really interesting how it used to be Republicans that got a lot of dark money. Now it's completely turned upside down, and Democrats are the king of dark money. Is that correct?
That's right. And let's not forget, too, that term it's not a legal term or a financial term. It's a political term. It's meant to sound scary and ominous. And that's because the left actually coined it in 2010, right around the time of the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, which really expanded the kind of outside money that can go into politics, for better or for worse, depending on your position. But they coined that because they believed so much of this outside money would go to help elect Republicans. Sounds a little silly, the idea of corporate money backing Republicans in the day of Google and Facebook and Meta and the like, but back then they really did believe that. And so they created this idea of dark money with these unaccountable, shady billionaires. And, while there's obviously a lot of truth to that, I've made my living looking at how the left abuses these things that they say that conservatives are masters of. In reality, dark money is the kind of free speech protected by the Constitution's First Amendment that the left wants to silence. That's why they use loaded, scary political terms to try and gut our free speech laws and do the kinds of, evil weaponization of justice that we're seeing happen in our country right now.
Well, you understand politics. And so at this point, do you have any indication that the Democrats really want to get rid of dark money anymore? Or do you think they want to keep the gravy train flowing?
But why would they want to get rid of something that's given them so much power? Has given them Congress after Congress, has given them, unseated a Republican president and gave us Joe Biden. I mean, why wouldn't they do that? I mean, you mentioned dark money. One of the biggest networks in America, the biggest network in America, is run by a company called Arabella Advisors in Washington, D.C. It operated in the shadows for about 15 years before I discovered it. First of anybody in the country to report on this thing. By happenstance, I'll report. No great genius of mine, just stumbling across this thing. This is a network that brings in $1.7 billion every year. It's a series of organizations, but if it was one nonprofit, it would be one of the top nonprofits in the country, bigger than the Salvation Army or Goodwill even. But you never hear about anything reported on it until we started forcing the left to actually hold itself accountable. But that doesn't mean they're actually going to do that. They're not going to change the laws, not unless they see political advantage in defeating Republicans.
100%. And I don't think people appreciate the type of work it takes to start tracking some of this stuff. Like, the way you uncovered that, it really takes a lot of work and doing a lot of digging. How difficult is it to get information to begin to expose the leftist network?
When I say nonprofits, I'm talking about things like your church, for instance, or the Salvation Army or Goodwill. It's that part of the tax code that originally was set up to encourage charity and philanthropy. This includes all the biggest private foundations in America. And these are all tax-exempt groups. And in the case of what we call 501c3 groups, like your church, contributions to those are tax deductible. But there's a trade-off, and that's a good thing. But there's a trade-off, and that is there's a certain level of transparency that Congress requires these groups to give to the American public, which makes sense. And you'd think a journalist myself would find it very easy to dig through the kinds of disclosures that these organizations are required to file. Well, to a degree, but what we found is those laws tend to be very out of date and were written at a time largely when the left hadn't figured out how to weaponize these charitable groups into electing Democrats and making policy. But they have. Starting in the 1970s, groups like the Tides Foundation out in California have figured out that, well, hey, wait a minute, we can take advantage of these tax-deductible structures to move money from billionaires and mega donors It wipes away their name in the process because we can form as a middleman and pass that money off to groups that are doing political work all over the country. And when I say political work, I mean things like pushing for DC statehood, trying to pass laws that would restrict your right to give to groups anonymously, ironically, all of the worst ideas of the left, packing the Supreme Court, for instance. And what we found is they've so figured out with their great white shoe lawyers how to avoid transparency that they take advantage of these fairly loose laws. And I'm the last guy to say Congress needs to pass more laws, but unfortunately, we're in the case right now that doing this kind of job and reporting what the left is engaged in has gotten harder and harder, and I'm afraid Congress has to do something about it. Otherwise, we're going to continue to live in the dark.
And a big part of the money flow is to a lot of these get out the vote groups that just push leftist ideology. They say that they don't endorse political candidates, but they are pushing an agenda and pushing certain candidates. And we saw in the last election in 2020, I mean, you had the Zuckerbucks, almost $500 million, $500 million taking over local election operations. Do you think Republicans and conservatives have been very slow to catch on to what's really going on out there? I mean, you just wrote a piece about the left's playbook against the right when it comes to the 2024 election. Do you think that Republicans need to wake up out there?
Yeah, I think saying that we've been slow in the uptake is putting it generously, to be frank with you. We have been totally maybe a decade behind how these guys think. Just look at the Zuckerbucks case. So my report in December 2020 was the first in the country to look at this, back when we knew almost nothing about this, except we knew one thing. The left was trying to privatize the 2020 election in a number of cities and counties in a handful of swing states, just enough to tip the scales in Joe Biden's favor. Why do I say that? Because the election was not decided by a few million votes. It was decided by 43,000 votes in 3 states, 3 battleground states, all of which Trump won in 2016. The left knew this and planned accordingly. So while our side, for instance, was banking on politics as usual, we'll go flood Republican voters on election day, and hey, I was one of them, right? The left planned for how do we
I was warning about it.
Yes, exactly. How do we massively expand our mail-in ballots? How do we expand voter registration? And what we're really kind of talking about is most people think politics is run by the 2 parties in Washington, D.C., but in reality, the Democratic Party is surrounded by this apparatus of billions of dollars worth of these nonprofit organizations that actually run the progressive left and actually move that party to the left and set their policy objectives. And we've seen this. So you mentioned voter registration. We've calculated at Restoration of America that the left spends upwards of $500 million every year just doing nothing but registering new Democrats, not Republicans and Democrats. They find where people using cynical demographics. Are you non-white? Are you college educated? Are you under 40, a millennial, right? Where do you live, in a city, in a rural area? Are you in a swing state? Are you married or single? All of these different kinds of demographic data that strongly suggest how you're likely to vote. They use these sorts of things to find people who are not registered and pour a fortune into registering them to vote and making sure they do it. But on the conservative side, there's almost no money going into voter registration and hasn't been in the last decade. This is why the left managed to turn out 81 million ballots for Joe Biden in 2020, despite his campaign doing hardly anything to turn out the vote for himself. It's because the left has a machine at work that the right is only beginning to be aware of, let alone copy.
Oh, they've certainly had their problems. And I warned in September of 2020 what was going on and what Republicans should pay attention to, and that their lawyers should start making agreements now with election officials on how ballots are going to be counted and accessed and all that. Now, across your research, these nonprofit get out the vote groups, because I see them as a big problem. Did you find that some of these groups are also grant funded by the United States government, that our tax dollars are also going to some of these groups?
Indirectly. So what I have found is back in 2021, one of the first things that Biden did after he was sworn in was pass an executive order, which orders the federal agencies that do business with people, so like Indian Health Services, for instance, or Social Security Administration, to start registering people in the course of their normal duties. So this is not like the motor voter law from 1993, which says we can offer voter registration when you come in to apply for your Social Security benefits. This means if you're a college student looking for a federal loan to go to college, you get that loan and then you get a voter registration form in the mail right next to it. Or if you're a Native American on the reservation going to Indian Health Services, guess what? Why didn't you register to vote on the way out? Or my favorite, if you're a newly naturalized citizen, you get sworn in. Why don't you come over to this booth over here and we'll make sure we register you to vote? You know, that's never happened in 250 years of this country's history, weaponizing the federal government to do what these nonprofit groups are already doing. And I don't think anybody knows how much money it's cost us. I know others have tried to do freedom of information requests to the federal government, simply asking on what parameters are you using to try and register people? And also, how are you guaranteeing that these people are actually citizens who are eligible to register, that they're not double registered or double voting? That's the state's prerogative, not the federal government's, right? According to the Constitution. And they've been turned down, to my knowledge, every last one of them. So this is absolutely what we talk about when we say that the federal government has been turned into an extension of the Democratic Party, and they're using it to try and elect Democrats and beat Republicans. This is not the old days of neutral government serving anybody and the party in power. This is the way third world dictatorships and banana republics work, and we'll never get it back if we don't defeat them.
Absolutely. I mean, I constantly point out that Americans need to wake up. I mean, our own tax dollars are going to fund censorship apparatuses that are being built out in the higher education institutions on behalf of the federal government to actually silence our voices. So we're paying for that, just like we're paying for the left's Get Out the Vote campaign. Now, you say in 2024, the left wants to mirror what they did in 2020. Can you explain that to the audience?
So everybody remembers that the left dramatically changed thousands of election laws during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, right? And when I say that, I mean things like extending early voting, or in many states where you have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot, like you're going to be out of the country, for instance. They either waived that excuse or made being locked down at your home in some states an excuse to get an absentee ballot. So, and why did that happen? Because Democrats everywhere realized this is their ticket to effectively making the first all-mail election in U.S. history. Something a few states have done before, but never at a national scale, and never in places like New Jersey, where they went all mail for the 2020 election.
But the government said it was the safest and most secure election that we've ever had.
Yes, yes.
You're telling me that they were lying?
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, according to their own side, I mean, just a quick tangent here. If you go back to the 2008 Democratic primary, where absolutely no conservatives were involved, you can find that in Florida had a problem, go figure, and the Hillary Clinton campaign demanded a recount. And guess who protested that? David Plouffe, who ran Barack Obama's primary campaign. I have to paraphrase him, but he said something to the effect of, we don't trust the security of running this election through the mail as the state of Florida was proposing. And you know what's amazing? If you went up to 2019, you'd find that the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, was pretty united on saying this is the least safe way to run an election. COVID changed that. They all got on board, and I would point out that's largely because a handful of activist groups that have been pushing all-mail elections for years. One of them is called the National Vote at Home Institute. These groups largely paved the way because this is how the Democratic Party actually functions. All of this is to say, these measures were sold as temporary solutions to deal with the COVID pandemic. They were not. They've been codified into law in almost all of the states where Democrats have the power to do so, and in many purple states where the legislatures or the governor's mansions are divided. So what we're seeing now is Democrats want to go even further. They want things like automatic voter registration. What does that mean? Well, that $500 million that foundations and lefty activists put into registering new voters, they want you and I to pay for that through our state tax dollars. Why not have the states do it automatically instead of letting the activists do it? They want same-day voter registration. That means you can register for a ballot and cast that ballot on election day. And if you go to places like New York State, where there's no photo ID, this means there's nothing stopping an illegal alien from applying to registering to vote under a false name and address and casting a ballot that day. And there's no time for election officials to verify that application, even if they care to do so in that state. And the list goes on, but this is the kind of stuff that they want to do permanently. And the only way to defeat it is to fight back wherever we can and defeat it in Congress where needed.
Yeah, I constantly hear Republicans talking about, and I'm talking about ordinary Republicans, well, we're not going to win an election if we don't fix the election system and blah, blah, blah. And they keep harping about it. I say, you got to win an election to fix the election system. That's the most important thing. And it always, two things amaze me. the first thing is that you're talking about redoing the entire way we have known voting for 200 plus years, redoing it into this idea of mail-in balloting. We dropped signature verifications, which to me was one of the biggest things that nobody's paid attention to. But more importantly, like it amazes me, we can't even fix potholes right? When we look at government, we look at potholes, they can't even do that correctly. But we're supposed to pretend that they could change an entire way of voting 6 months before an election, and there was no problem. So it was a safe and secure election. But when we look at it, what do Republicans need to do to prepare for 2024 this time? I was criticizing Republicans when you had former President Trump and many other Republicans say Republicans need to go out on election day. They need to vote on election day.
Yeah.
Because I know human instinct is you could come up with 1,000 excuses not to go out on election day. And so what should Republicans be doing in 2024 to prepare for this election cycle?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is don't expect it to be a normal election. I mean, there's always a chance that whoever the Republican nominee, maybe Donald Trump, maybe somebody else, that individual will win, the old-fashioned way, just gets more votes, maybe. But I don't think after 2020 we should expect that's going to be the norm. What I'm anticipating is the left is going to do exactly what they did in 2020 by coming up with some new novel idea that you, me, and nobody else on the right is devious enough to think up at this point. I totally anticipate that's going to happen. So whoever the Republican nominee is, he or she needs to be prepared with a team of lawyers that is going to fight through January, longer if need be. This is not going to be wrapped up, obviously, election night or 3 or 4 weeks after.
It's amazing. In the 1980s, when we were using paper and pen, or we were going into booths and pulling down tabs, that we were able to figure out who won an election on election night. Today, we have all this new technology that's supposed to make everything seamless and easier, and yet it takes weeks to figure out who won an election.
Try the 1800s when farmers had to walk or take their horse and buggy to go poll, go to the polling place, and managed to do it on a certain Tuesday in November. But we can't do it if we don't have 45 days of early voting. It's just remarkable.
Before debates even take place.
That's one thing. I'm also paying attention to efforts right now by certain activist groups to try and remove Trump from the ballot. They're targeting 9 states. I don't think it'll stop there. If they got all 9, and this would include battleground states like North Carolina, also blue states like California, what would that accomplish? It would disenfranchise, literally remove the vote from 25 million people who backed President Trump in 2020. 25 million people would be, and that's just the ones who voted for him in 2020, not to say all the ones he could win over in 2024 or any other nominee that the Republicans put forward, right? This is a huge effort. Now, I don't know that that's going to go through. It's got a lot of Supreme Court ramifications. This is what I mean when I say the left is devious and novel. They will come up with some kind of strategy. So we need to fight for, I would say, vote early in your state if it's the law. Take advantage of these things.
I just want to interrupt you a second, just because I want to remind my audience, prior to the 2020 elections in September, I did an episode on how Democrats and Never Trumpers and the neocons, how they were simulating war game elections, how they were simulating all the different potential outcomes of the election. And it's amazing to me that Republicans haven't picked up on that. So you go ahead. You were talking about making sure that Republicans in early voting states take advantage of that.
Yes, I encourage voting in person. I think it's the most secure thing. But there's going to be individuals, especially seniors, who are going to have to vote by mail. In your states where you can track those things, we have a website, Voter Reference Foundation, that helps you track whether you're registered to vote and whether you're double registered, or if you've moved across state lines, whether you're registered to vote there. That's up to citizens to try and remove themselves from that. We can do small steps like that to actually ensure that our vote counts. And I know that's a platitude, but it's true. Do these things and be aware of it, but also go into anticipating it's going to be weeks and weeks just to come up with the final count on the ballots. And then it's going to be probably months of litigation where if the Republican wins, the left sues. If the left wins, the Republicans sue. This is just going to be the new reality until we sort things out.
But are we now not allowed to challenge elections anymore? I mean, we have President Trump, former president, that just literally got charged with questioning the results of an election, essentially. So now have Democrats place themselves in a bind when, if a Republican wins in 2024, it's going to be really difficult for them to challenge those results. at least in the eyes of the public perception. I mean, they'll do everything they can and try and win. But it amazes me that you will see all the arguments that they used against President Trump just as of. They'll be like, well, we really mean it. We need to challenge this election. And the hypocrisy in politics knows no bounds. Now, another thing that you argue that progressives are trying to do is the idea of ranked voting. You have an article out in Idaho that they're trying to do that. Other states are trying to do that. Explain to the audience what ranked voting is and why ranked voting should not exist.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm smart enough to explain how ranked choice voting works because I don't think anybody actually is. So this is one of the new fronts we're seeing on the election integrity front. Let me do my best to explain how it works. So when you go and you cast a ballot in a federal race or state race, you have, let's say, one office, senator, and you're ticking the name next to one individual. There's going to be one person who wins, and you vote for one candidate out of however many. What ranked choice voting proposes is you actually vote for all of the people running for that office, but you stack them. Let's say there's 5 candidates. You pick your top pick, he's number 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to the last person there. And when you submit that ballot, they use a complicated, opaque algorithm I'm not sure anybody understands in order to automatically go through various rounds. So the lowest vote getter in round 1, he gets dropped. Lowest vote getter in round 2, he gets dropped until you got 2 people left and the first one's declared the winner. Does it sound complicated and weird? That's the whole point. How does this actually work and function? Well, if you go to places like Alaska, we saw this in the 2022 midterms. Alaska is a bright red, ruby crimson Republican state. Nobody is surprised by that. It has not sent a Democrat to Congress in nearly 50 years, and it just did in the 2022 midterms, Mary Peltola. How did that happen? If you look at the ranked choice voting that was put forward through a ballot initiative funded by out-of-state dark money interests in California, Colorado, and Illinois on the 2020 ballot, that is, they first used that in 2022, and it ended up electing a Democrat. And if you look at the final numbers, you see why. There were 2 Republicans running. The biggest vote getter was Sarah Palin against her opponent. More people in Alaska, more Alaska voters, cast a ballot for the Republican candidates than did the Democrat Mary Peltola. But because there were 2 Republicans, it split the difference, and you ended up having a Democrat who won with something like 40% of the vote to the 60% that the 2 Republicans between them got. And because most people don't understand, when you go do a ranked choice ballot, you have to tick 5 boxes if there's 5 candidates. What a lot of them ended up doing is saying, well, I don't know all these guys. I just know the one, let's say Sarah Palin, that I want to vote for. And they ticked 1 box. That means when all of the rounds go through and their candidate drops off, their vote just dropped off with it. They no longer count. It's really convoluted. And the reason why the left wants it is because it can help you get improbable victories in places where if it was a straight up fair fight between a Republican and a Democrat, they'd have no chance of winning. Now, how do I know that? Because at the same time this year, on the other side of the country in Washington, D.C., in Arlington County, in my state of Virginia, Democrats fought a ranked choice initiative pushed by independents who wanted to try and push it there. The D.C. Democratic Party over this summer said, we do not want a ranked choice initiative in D.C. elections. Why? Because it'll disenfranchise Black and brown voters, their words, because they don't think that those people can figure out how it works. I don't think I can either, right? And it'll damage Democrat power in the District of Columbia, where they have total power. In other words, they know it'll do in Alaska to them, and they don't want to risk that. That's why they support it in red states and fight it in blue states. Last quick anecdote on this is fun. At the same time, across the Potomac River, Arlington County's electoral board, which is all Democrat, voted late last year to start using ranked choice voting in their county elections. This would be the first time in my state that they'd try this. Well, 3 or 4 months later, they walked back that thing and said, we're not actually going to use ranked choice in this November when we have elections. Why? Because they had voters come in and try it out, and everybody left angry, frustrated, and confused. And when activists came to try and sell the electoral board said, yeah, we're all for it. And when people asked them, can you explain how ranked choice voting works? They couldn't explain the bill that they voted for. I mean, I'm sure that's not the last we'll hear about it, but this is something taking off that we have to fight in your state. So a few states in Republican areas have passed legislation barring or banning ranked choice voting from ever taking place in their elections, which is excellent. Every state needs to do that.
Yeah, and if we look at California, I mean, that's how you X out Republicans on the list. I mean, in
Yes.
a lot of races in California, it's just two Democrats go head to head because they're the top two vote getters. So it's insane. So Hayden, you wrote this new piece. It's a great piece. I have links up at the PAS Report website, so everyone check it out, pasreport.com. So Warren Buffett, great investor, brilliant investor. I mean, here's a guy that really has made a fortune. He's known as the Oracle of Omaha, but you are calling him the Butcher of Omaha. So can you explain to the audience why Warren Buffett is the Butcher of Omaha?
Yes, and this does not mean you shouldn't take his stock advice, but this is something you should know more about this individual next time we look to him for his wonderful old man who's a kind of a conservative and has traditional American values. He absolutely does not. Warren Buffett is almost certainly the single largest funder of abortion in human history. Why do I get to say that? Because we crunched the numbers at Restoration of America and found that in the past 20 years, Buffett has funded at least $5.3 billion into groups that do abortions or support the abortion industry, lobbying, advocacy, that sort of thing, pushing far left Democrats to support that. And $5.3 billion with a B, that's probably a conservative number, but that's the lowest number I could put together safely. It's probably significantly higher than that. People don't understand this, but Buffett, using his Berkshire Hathaway shares, that's how he's worth so much money, has quietly poured all of this money over 2 decades into foundations that are supposedly engaged in philanthropy, the Christian love of your fellow man. In reality,
I just want to interrupt you for one
please.
second. When people think of philanthropy, they think of, Cancer Society, the American Cancer Society, Habitat for Humanity, and groups that help homeless people like the Salvation Army. We look at philanthropy today. When did it become just deal with things like abortion, get into all these social issues, and get into issues that aren't really charitable? It's progressive agenda.
Yeah, and it happens slowly and surely over the last 2 decades. You can't really put a single date on it. I kind of going back to what we said at the top of the show, I really think a lot of it is when the left figured out that it's smarter to put money in these outside nonprofits and foundations and use them to kind of, from the outside in, influence elections and
It's
elect
like money
Democrats.
laundering.
We call it charitable money laundering for that reason. It's not a crime. They're
Do you think
following the
like we
law.
could use the RICO statute against them? I mean, since we're seeing legal jujitsu with the RICO statute down in Georgia, maybe the RICO
Well, yeah,
statute applies here.
and careful, you might get indicted for saying that. Who knows?
True. Good point.
But exactly, and Buffett's one of them. And everybody knows George Soros. Why do they know George Soros? Because after the 2004 elections, it became very clear that he was using outside groups like his Open Society foundations to pour money into these lefty causes. And the reason we have so many dozens of Soros DAs and prosecutors is because he used these nonprofits to pour a lot of money into their races and help turn these guys out. Buffett's a little bit different. Nobody thinks of him, he is a Democrat, but nobody thinks of him as very political. And the reason is because he doesn't promote that image. He promotes the image you want to see because he is a brilliant investor, smarter guy than I am. And yet all of his money is poured through a handful of family foundations associated with his late ex-wife and his children. And they move money into pro-abortion groups like Planned Parenthood, for instance. You could go down the list of some of these. Let me give you my favorite example. If you can have a favorite evil group, that is. One of the groups that Buffett's poured tens of millions of dollars into, it's called Pathfinder International. Nobody's ever heard of this group. It's not small, it's a large group based in Cambridge, but it's very obscure. And the reason why I like to point out to this is because Pathfinder has gotten $1 billion from our government through the foreign aid arm, USAID, over the years, in order to push pro-abortion policies in Africa and Latin America and Asia. Nobody knows how many people they've aborted there, but it's massive. And interestingly, if you go back in history, Pathfinder was created in the 1950s, back in the heyday of something I like to tie Warren Buffett to, the eugenics movement. Eugenics, to put a quick description here, eugenics is a term coined decades before by a guy named Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin. There's an important connection there. And it's used to describe this pseudoscience of beautifying or improving the human stock by just determining who gets to have children. So if you're an immigrant from Italy in the 1920s, they would deem you too stupid and inferior to have children. So we're going to sterilize you so that these wonderful Nordic Teutonic people over here, they get to have children, because that's how we're going to improve the gene pool over time. And while I don't think Warren Buffett practices that kind of eugenics these days, the kinds of pro-abortion groups that he does spend have their roots in that kind of thinking. This idea that you see with Bill Gates, a close friend, we are, we're like gods, and we can go and we can solve the world's great problems. And one of the great problems is global overpopulation. So we need to slowly curb the Earth's population, starting with all of those, pesky brown and yellow and black people down in Africa and Asia. And this is what they think. We've seen this for decades, and we finally exposed it.
Well, now I have to ask, because I find this amazing, and I find it actually really disturbing. You have all these wealthy individuals talking about the idea of overpopulation. I'm hearing it more and more and more. It's not like it's quieting down, it's actually ratcheting up. At the same time, I see governments around the world reducing their agricultural farmlands. They're reducing the number of cattle you could have on your farmlands, the number of acreage of crops you could have on your farmlands. Shouldn't that concern everyone? Like, when you have all these wealthy, powerful elite talking about that the world's overpopulated, like that right there should just be a huge red flag. At the same time, they're pushing to have agriculture being cut down. I mean, it didn't work during Mao's Cultural Revolution. It didn't go too well with the Great Leap Forward, right? A lot of Chinese people starved because of the Great Leap Forward. I don't see this playing out well in our lifetime either if they go through with this. Why hasn't anyone else been paying attention to this? I mean, you're looking at the money from the butcher of Omaha going to all these abortion practices. You hear the overpopulation talk. Why aren't more people paying attention?
Well, I think to be fair, people in the pro-life movement who are very active on the activist front, frankly, they are aware of this. So I don't want to pretend I'm the only one talking about it. They've been doing yeoman's work for years on this and have known about this. It's just that most Americans are not familiar with it. I think they are. I think COVID changed a lot of people's minds. Say what you will about the origins of the Wuhan virus, but people have seen how quickly governments around the West, well, everywhere really, tried to shut down their countries and are maybe possibly planning to do that again. We'll see. They've seen how malleable the populations in the United States and Europe really are. Why wouldn't they try to do that with something related to the climate and population? Because the left sees those as two fundamentally inseparable ideas. And I would point out, I actually think they're going to lose on this issue, not only because I believe in a transcendent God who runs all of these things. I don't think he's going to allow them to do that, but also because if you look at the economics and the science behind it, it just doesn't pan out, even according to their own twisted logic. Look, you brought up China. It's a great example. So China's one-child policy is probably the most enduring population control policy of all time. And I've written about others in India I'd love to get into in a minute, but that one only recently ended back in I think 2015, right?
Yeah, it was in place for decades. Like that's the biggest problem China has, and it's through their own self-inflicted wound.
Now let's think about how that came to pass, right? That was a sociological and economic policy decided in the 1970s by Chinese, starting with Mao and implemented by his successors, who believed that, wow, if you look at the rate that our population is exploding in China, we're going to starve ourselves into oblivion in a few decades. So we need to make sure we have fewer Chinese. You fast forward to the 1990s and the 2020s. One of the big reasons China had such explosive GDP is not only because they tried capitalism, they had a big population of young people from their 20s to their 30s and 40s who are working so many hours and so productively, it made them a significantly richer country than at any point in Chinese history. But all of those people have gray hairs now. They're all entering retirement by the hundreds of millions, and they only had one child per family in almost every case. This means China is looking at this dramatic population shrinkage. And I'm not the first one to talk about this. I'd point you all to Peter Zion, who's doing incredible work on all of this stuff. I'm a big fan of his work on this, showing that in the next 10 to 20 years, China's economy is going to collapse because you're not going to have nearly as many people working. So say goodbye to 10% annual GDP growth. Try GDP shrinkage, if you have any growth at all, it will be amazing. Well, the same is true everywhere else in the industrialized world. If you want to continue growing your economy, you have to have more young people working than you have old people retiring and draining the resources of the economy. I don't mean that in a cynical way.
Make
They're not
babies,
producing tax
Americans.
dollars.
You got to make
Exactly.
babies.
Yeah. Exactly. And, we're going to have some of that here, but not as dramatically, thank God, as China. But this is going to be something we're going to see around the world. And now you tell me, in a world where there are clearly not enough young people working, because there were not enough babies over the last 2 generations coming into that world, right? You really think the idea of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett saying we need fewer people is going to be popular? I don't think so at all. And this is why I think this idea is going to be chic right now, but it has a very near expiration date. But I say all that, it is doing a ton of damage in the meantime. And not the least of which is all of the millions, who knows how many hundreds of millions, perhaps, Africans and Latin Americans and Asians who are being targeted for abortion by these groups. Let me just raise one if I can. Marie Stopes International. Everybody in the United States has heard of Planned Parenthood. They have not heard of Marie Stopes, MSI. The woman herself was a contemporary to Margaret Sanger. She's like Britain's Margaret Sanger back about 100 years ago, liberalized their abortion laws. Well, Marie Stopes, which gets significant funding from Warren Buffett and even some from our federal government, I hate to say, is very active in promoting abortions overseas, even where it's illegal. One of the most amazing things I discovered in my research is that Kenya, of all places, backwards as so many of its policies are, Kenya's constitution recognizes the right to an individual's life at conception. I mean, that's remarkable considering we aren't that forward thinking in the United States. They have that. Well, Kenya has banned Marie Stopes and others from doing abortions in their country because they don't follow the laws, they don't follow the procedures. And a few years ago, Kenyan police found an illegal facility where Marie Stopes doctors were performing illegal operations with no license, no legal regulation or oversight, like the left always says they want. And you know how they found it? Because the doctors were pitching the rotting corpses of babies and fetuses into a dumpster outside this facility. They finally shut it down, deported the doctors, and closed the whole thing. And you know what happened at the same time? Marie Stopes' leadership in other places like South Africa were bragging about it and asking for more money to do this everywhere else. This is the kind of evil. When I say he's the butcher of Omaha, I'm not trying to be tongue-in-cheek. This is exactly what I'm saying. These things would not be possible without extremely wealthy Western billionaires like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and many others who are making it possible by, frankly, aborting the third world. And it's just raw evil.
Well, Hayden, I appreciate all the work you're doing, all the research you've done. It's phenomenal. Keep it going. We're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report so everyone can check out Hayden's work at Restoration of America. Thanks for coming on, Hayden.
Nick, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.